A sharp crack echoed through the empty street. The slap was brutal, raw, cutting through the night like a gunshot. Detective Ava Carter's head snapped to the side, her cheek stinging from the force of the blow. A thin trail of blood glided from the corner of her lip, catching the dim glow of the streetlights. But she did not stumble. She did not flinch. Instead, she stood still, her dark, piercing eyes locked onto the man before her. Officer Bradley Cooper's smirk faltered. His hand still hovered near his belt, his stance wide with authority, but something in Ava's expression sent a ripple of unease through him. The air between them thickened with something unspoken, something dangerous. The night, once peaceful, had turned into a silent battlefield. The flickering streetlight above them cast distorted shadows on the pavement, elongating their figures as if the universe itself was stretching out this moment, holding its breath for what was to come. Then Ava moved. Not in anger, not in fear, but with the deliberate, controlled movements of someone who had been here before, someone who knew exactly how this would end. Her fingers slipped into the pocket of her fitted joggers, slow and intentional. Cooper's instincts kicked in. His breath hitched, and his fingers twitched near his holster. He expected retaliation. He expected her to lash out, to scream, to fight back. But what she pulled out was not a weapon. It was a badge. The golden emblem of law enforcement glinted under the streetlight, cold and undeniable. The moment stretched, the weight of it pressing down on Cooper like an iron grip around his throat. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. His brain fought to process the reality before him. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted. The hunter had just become the hunted. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The golden glow of the streetlights cast long stretched shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The air was still, heavy with an unsettling quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rows of elegant houses lined the clean sidewalks, their manicured lawns pristine, their front porches adorned with warm porch lights. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved at their neighbors, where laughter from children playing in fenced yards was a common sound, where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. But underneath the polished surface, something else festered. A quiet, unspoken rule existed here. Some doors locked a little faster when unfamiliar faces walked by. Some eyes lingered too long when a person of color strolled through these streets. Ava Carter had seen it before. She had felt it in the side glances at grocery stores, in the polite but firm interrogations when visiting new places, and now, here, standing on this very street, she was feeling it again, pressed against her skin like an unwelcome touch. She remained still, her badge now gleaming in the dim light, the tension in the air thick enough to choke. Even in her casual athletic wear, a gray tank top clinging to her toned frame, black joggers fitting snugly around her legs, she carried herself with an air of quiet power. Her long, dark braids cascaded down her back, framing a face that exuded both resilience and exhaustion. She had spent her life fighting battles that should not have to be fought. Fighting against a system that refused to change, against people like the man who stood before her. Officer Bradley Cooper's stance had shifted. His arrogance had turned to uncertainty. Mid-40s, sharp-featured, his uniform crisp and authoritative, he had always seen himself as the protector of people like him. A seasoned cop with a long history of racial profiling, he had patrolled these streets for years, deciding who belonged and who did not. His word had always been final, his authority unquestioned, until now. He stared at the badge in Ava's hand, his throat tightening, his pulse hammering in his ears. His power, the thing he had always clung to so desperately, was slipping through his fingers. And for the first time in his life, Officer Bradley Cooper was the one who felt out of place. The air was thick with tension, the quiet hum of the suburban night suddenly disrupted by the flashing of red and blue lights. Just moments ago, everything had been peaceful, ordinary. But now, the calm was an illusion, shattered by the weight of a decision that never should have been made. Officer Bradley Cooper's pulse pounded against his temples as he stared at the badge in Ava Carter's hand. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. His breath grew shallow, his uniform suddenly too tight around his chest. His entire career had been built on control, on his ability to dictate who belonged and who did not. Yet, standing before him now was a woman who was tearing that power apart piece by piece. But this wasn't where it all started. No, this story had begun minutes earlier, with a single choice that would change everything. 30 minutes earlier, Officer Cooper had been patrolling his usual route. The streets were quiet, just as he liked them. The wealthy homes stood in perfect rows, their lights glowing softly against the night sky. The sidewalks were empty, the world settled into its comfortable routine. But then, he saw her, a black woman dressed in athletic gear, walking alone through the neighborhood. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. Something about the sight unsettled him. He had been patrolling this area for years, and he knew most of the residents, at least the ones who mattered. But he didn't recognize her. His gut twisted, that familiar sense of suspicion crawling up his spine. What's she doing here at this hour? He knew the answer he wanted, and in his mind it justified everything that came next. Slowly, he pressed his foot to the brake, letting the red and blue lights flicker for a moment before keeping them steady. A message, a warning, a reminder of power. The woman, Ava Carter, did not stop. She kept walking, her pace unhurried, her posture relaxed. She didn't panic, didn't look over her shoulder in fear. And that right there, made his blood simmer. Cooper shifted the car into park. This wasn't over. Ava heard the sound of the door slamming before she turned around. The heavy, deliberate thud of boots against pavement reached her ears, each step echoing with authority. She exhaled slowly, already knowing what was coming. When she finally turned, her eyes met his. A tall, broad-shouldered cop, his stance wide, his hand resting near his holster. The streetlight above them cast shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. But she didn't need to see his face to know exactly what he was thinking. "You live around here." His voice was controlled, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Ava didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. "Yes. Something wrong, officer?" The moment stretched between them. A silent war waged in the space of a few heartbeats. Cooper's fingers curled slightly against his belt. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't scrambling for an excuse, for an explanation. He was used to that, people tripping over their words, apologizing for their presence. But this woman was different. "Just doing my job, ma'am." "Need to see some ID." Ava remained still. She had seen this before, too many times. Cases like these, headlines flashing across the news, names turned into hashtags, faces forever frozen in videos that should never have existed. She had been on the other side of these investigations, had seen the patterns, the excuses, the ugly truth masked beneath protocol. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice even, steady. Cooper's jaw clenched. "I asked for ID. A quiet tension settled in the air, so thick it was suffocating. A small group of bystanders had begun to gather at a distance, just far enough to pretend they weren't staring, but close enough to watch. A young man in a hoodie shifted slightly, raising his phone just enough to start recording. The glow of the screen flickered against the darkness, unnoticed by Cooper. Ava slowly crossed her arms. And I asked if I did something wrong. Cooper's hand shifted closer to his gun. That was all the confirmation she needed. His patience snapped like a rubber band stretched too thin. Cooper stepped forward, closing the space between them in an instant. His boots hit the pavement hard. His shoulders squared in a show of dominance. I said, "Show me your damn ID." Ava didn't move. Her posture remained the same, her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. Her expression didn't change, except for the slightest shift in her jaw, a subtle tightening, a flicker of something unreadable behind her eyes. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice lower now, edged with warning. That single sentence, that refusal to comply, to submit, set him off. A flash of anger surged through Cooper. His pulse spiked, his vision narrowed. His hand moved before his mind even registered the decision. And then the slap. The impact of his hand against her cheek cracked through the silence like a gunshot. The force of it sent Ava's head slightly to the side, her cheek burning from the sting. A thin trail of blood appeared at the corner of her lip, catching the dim glow of the street light. A woman in the distance let out a small, horrified gasp. A child nearby whimpered. Somewhere, a car alarm went off, its shrill blare filling the empty street. Ava remained upright. She did not stumble. She did not step back. She did not cry out. She stood there, still, motionless, except for the slow, deliberate way she turned her head back to face him. Cooper's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his adrenaline still rushing through him. He had expected something: anger, screaming, fear, resistance. But what he saw in her eyes made his stomach twist. There was no fear, no panic, just certainty. A quiet, unshakable power burned in her gaze, so absolute that it sent a flicker of unease down his spine. And that was the moment Officer Bradley Cooper knew. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. The air had changed. It was no longer just thick with tension. It was suffocating. Officer Bradley Cooper could feel something shifting, but he refused to acknowledge it. His chest still heaved with adrenaline, his hand tingling from the slap he had just delivered. He had expected resistance. He had expected fear. But standing before him, unmoving, was something he had not prepared for: Ava Carter. She had barely reacted to the slap. Her head had turned slightly from the impact, but she had not stumbled, had not cried out. A thin trail of blood had formed at the corner of her lip, catching the dim glow of the streetlight. But she had not wiped it away, not immediately. She had let it sit there, a stark contrast against her dark skin, as if making sure the world saw exactly what had just happened. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, she lifted her hand and wiped the blood away with the back of her fingers. There was no rush, no hesitation, just an eerie, practiced calm. The kind that made people uneasy, the kind that made them rethink their choices. Cooper smirked, forcing the doubt creeping into his chest to stay buried. He rolled his shoulders back, shifting on his feet, trying to shake the unfamiliar weight pressing down on him. He had dealt with people like her before, defiant, stubborn, thinking they could challenge authority. It never worked out in their favor. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Ava said, her voice even, controlled. Cooper scoffed, shaking his head. How many times had he heard that before? People always said that when they thought they could turn things around. It never meant anything. He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the pavement, towering over her, his presence casting a shadow. "Oh, yeah?" he said, amusement laced in his voice. "And why's that?" Iva's lips barely moved, but there was something in her expression that made the smirk on Cooper's face falter for just a second. It was not defiance. It was not anger. It was something worse. It was certainty. Then she moved. Her hand slipped into her pocket. Cooper's training took over before his brain could process it. His breath hitched, his fingers twitched toward his holster, his muscles tensed. The moment stretched. Someone in the crowd gasped, the anticipation thick enough to drown in. And then the world shifted. Because what she pulled out was not a weapon. It was a badge, a golden emblem of authority, glinting under the streetlight like a death sentence. For the first time that night, Cooper felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. The badge was real. The authority it carried was real. And what he had just done, that was real too. His smirk vanished. His body stiffened. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The reality of the situation had hit him like a tidal wave, but his mind was still clawing for an escape, still scrambling to make sense of what he was seeing. No. His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. Then louder, more frantic. This has to be fake. Ava took a step forward. The crowd murmured, the tension among them shifting from uneasy spectators to something else entirely. The glow of recording phones flickered, lenses zooming in, catching every detail of Cooper's unraveling. "Detective Ava Carter," she said, her voice smooth as steel. "Head of Internal Affairs." Cooper's stomach plummeted. Internal Affairs. The very department that could destroy officers like him. The division that investigated corruption, misconduct, abuse of power. His badge did not protect him anymore. His mouth opened again, but nothing came out. He stepped back slightly, a barely noticeable movement, but it was there. A retreat. The first instinct of a man who realized he had just walked into his own downfall. Ava tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. She did not need to say anything for him to understand that she had already won. "You just assaulted a superior officer," she continued, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "And every single person here saw it." The bystanders were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses. The phones recording were no longer just capturing a moment. They were documenting his collapse. Cooper's breath grew uneven, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He had spent years walking these streets, making people afraid, reminding them who held the power. And now, he was the one who was afraid. This was not just a mistake. This was the end. The world around them had changed. It was no longer just a confrontation between an officer and a civilian. It was something much bigger now, a reckoning. The power that Officer Bradley Cooper had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers like sand. The badge in Ava Carter's hand had sealed his fate, and the crowd surrounding them had become more than just silent onlookers. They had become witnesses to his downfall. Phones were raised higher now, capturing every second of his unraveling. The glow of recording screens flickered in the darkness, framing Cooper in digital evidence that would soon be impossible to erase. His breath came faster, the reality sinking in like a slow poison. Then came the voices, muffled at first, then louder, clearer. "That's Internal Affairs. "Oh my God, she's IA. He's done. This guy is done. That's going viral. That's going everywhere." Cooper's throat tightened as he turned his head, scanning the crowd. Some had their mouths covered in shock, others whispered urgently, eyes wide with the realization of what they had just witnessed. And then, just as he feared, someone uploaded the video. The moment was immortalized in pixels, sent into the world within seconds. The notification pings started almost immediately. A ripple of reactions moved through the crowd, and the first set of gasps came as people saw the video hit their screens in real time. The title flashed across different social media platforms, spreading like wildfire. "Racist cop slaps. Black woman then learns she's the head of internal affairs." News outlets picked it up within minutes. Hashtags started trending. Millions of people across the country were watching. The footage was undeniable. The crisp slap, the flickering streetlights, the gasps of the onlookers, and finally, Ava Carter holding up her badge, revealing who she was. It was the kind of moment that changed careers, the kind of moment that destroyed them. The faint sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. The backup Cooper had radioed for earlier was finally arriving. 3 squad cars pulled up, their tires screeching to a halt. Officers stepped out, their hands instinctively reaching toward their holsters, expecting a dangerous situation. But what they found was something else entirely. Ava Carter stood firm in the center of the chaos, her badge still visible in her hand. Cooper stood frozen, his body locked in a mixture of panic and disbelief. The crowd watched in pure, electrified anticipation. One of the arriving officers, Sergeant Mills, stepped forward. His gaze flicked between Cooper, Ava, and the dozens of phones recording every second of what was happening. "Someone explain what's going on here," Mills demanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the night air. Ava did not hesitate. "Arrest him." The words were calm, authoritative, final. Silence followed. Sergeant Mills blinked, his mind catching up with what he had just heard. His eyes darted to Cooper, still standing there in stunned silence, before returning to Ava. Cooper found his voice, stepping forward slightly. "Wait, hold on. This is a misunderstanding." Ava's gaze didn't waver. He assaulted a superior officer, and every single person here saw it. Cooper's mouth snapped shut. Mills hesitated. Cooper was one of them, a fellow officer, a man they had worked alongside for years. But Ava Carter was internal affairs. And in their world, her word overrode everything. A slow realization settled over them. Cooper was no longer their colleague. He was a suspect. The hesitation broke. Mills exhaled through his nose and gave the nod. "Cuff him." 2 officers stepped forward. Panic shot through Cooper's chest. He backed away. His mind scrambled for something, anything, to make this stop, to undo this nightmare unfolding before him. You can't be serious," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm the one who—" "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The command came from the officer behind him, voice neutral, professional. Cooper's hands curled into fists. He wanted to fight, wanted to argue, to shout, to make them see that this wasn't fair. But the cameras were still rolling. The whole world was watching. With a reluctant, shaky breath, he slowly turned around. The cold bite of metal snapped around his wrists. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. Ava Carter did not smirk. She did not gloat. She simply watched. The shift in power was complete. Cooper had always believed himself to be untouchable, that the badge on his chest made him immune to consequences, that the system would always protect him. But the system was bigger than him, and this time the system had watched him fall. The metal cuffs locked around Officer Bradley Cooper's wrists felt heavier than they should have. His breaths came shallow, rapid, his mind spinning as reality bore down on him with crushing force. The crowd remained silent for a moment, absorbing the sight before them. An officer, once untouchable, now reduced to nothing more than a criminal in uniform. The irony was unmistakable. Ava Carter did not flinch as she watched him being led away. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction in his downfall. Justice was not about revenge, it was about accountability. And finally, for the first time in his life, Bradley Cooper was being held accountable. The news spread faster than anyone could have expected. Within hours, headlines flooded every major network. Racist cop arrested after assaulting internal affairs officer. Corrupt officer's history of abuse exposed in stunning investigation. Ava wasted no time. The investigation was launched immediately. She sat in the Internal Affairs office, watching as file after file of Cooper's history came across her desk. It was worse than she had imagined. Years of complaints, dozens of reports of excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of power, all buried, all ignored. The same system that claimed to uphold justice had protected him for years, shielding him from the consequences of his own actions. But now, the system had turned against him. His colleagues, once silent, once complicit, began to speak out. Officers who had witnessed his brutality but had been too afraid to challenge him were finally stepping forward. The weight of the case against him grew heavier with each testimony. He did this all the time. One officer admitted in a confidential interview. He knew no one would stop him, but someone had stopped him, and her name was Ava Carter. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and outside the courthouse protesters gathered, holding signs that demanded justice. The world was watching now. There was no more hiding, no more covering up the truth. Cooper sat at the defense table, his uniform replaced with a stiff suit, his hands clenched together. He no longer looked like the man who had once ruled the streets with unchecked authority. He looked small, defeated. The prosecution did not have to work hard to prove their case. The evidence was overwhelming. The video footage was undeniable. The testimonies were damning. Ava sat in the front row, her face unreadable as she listened to the final statements. The jury left to deliberate, but it did not take them long. When they returned, the verdict was clear. On the charge of assaulting a superior officer, guilty. On the charge of misconduct and abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of violating civil rights, guilty. Cooper's face did not change, but his hands trembled. His career, his entire identity was over. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Bradley Cooper, you have disgraced the uniform you once wore. You have betrayed the public trust. Today, you face the consequences of your actions. I hereby sentence you to 5 years in prison. A murmur rippled through the room. Some gasped, some nodded in approval. Others simply watched in silence, knowing that justice had finally been served. Cooper's shoulders sagged. He looked around as if searching for something, someone to save him. But there was no one left. The officers he had once worked alongside refused to meet his gaze. And Ava Carter, she never looked away. She wanted him to understand one thing before he was taken away. This was not just about him. This was about every person who had suffered under the weight of corruption. This was about change. and change had finally come. The impact of Cooper's case did not end in the courtroom. The world had seen the truth, and now there was no turning back. Within weeks, the police department announced major reforms. New training policies were implemented focusing on de-escalation, racial bias, and accountability. Officers who had once stayed silent began speaking up, exposing other corrupt individuals within the force. The old system, one that had protected men like Cooper for years, was beginning to crumble. Ava watched it all unfold, but she did not celebrate. There was still work to be done. Justice was not a single moment. It was a constant fight, and she had been fighting for it her entire life. One evening, not long after the trial, she walked through her neighborhood again. The same streets where she had once been stopped, the same sidewalks where she had once been questioned for existing. But this time, something was different. This time, there were no flashing lights, no officers slowing down to assess whether she belonged, no suspicion lingering in the air. Instead, as she passed a patrol car parked nearby, the officer inside gave her a small nod, a nod of respect. Ava Carter exhaled, feeling the weight in her chest ease just a little. The fight was not over, but tonight, at least, justice had won. Ava Carter walked down the same streets where she had once been stopped, but tonight they felt different. There were no flashing police lights, no accusations, no questions of whether she belonged. The weight of injustice that had once suffocated this place had begun to lift, even if only slightly. She had fought battles like this her entire life. She knew this one victory did not mean the war was over. There would always be more Coopers in the world. Officers who abused their power, systems that protected them, silence that allowed it to continue. But she also knew this: change had begun. And change, when it starts, is unstoppable. Somewhere across the city, in homes and on screens around the world, people had watched the fall of a corrupt man. They had witnessed what happened when power was challenged, when justice refused to bend. Some would be inspired. Some would speak out. Some would finally find the courage to act. Because justice was not about one case. It was about every case, every voice, every fight. When power is unchecked, corruption grows. But when justice stands unshaken, change is inevitable. Have you ever witnessed injustice firsthand? Comment below. Your voice matters. Make sure to subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. And just like that, the screen fades to black.